Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. We really appreciate your calling in today for this really great conversation we're about to have. My name is John Basili. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of Pride in Our Workplace. This is our third session for 2020. And as you know, we've been through a really tough year, to say the least. And Pride in Our Workplace has been around since 2006. And really our focus has always been to sort of connect the LGBTQ community and the business community and really help our LGBTQ employee resource groups and companies help engage members, help professionally develop themselves and their teams, work with their leadership to help create inclusive workplaces. We've had several really good sessions this year. We really took a shift this year and really started to look at the intersection between racial justice and LGBTQ equality. We had a great session on June 30th, if you were able to make that. And this one is really sort of almost a continuation of that conversation. So, you know, we really talked a lot about what was happening in the world, how folks were feeling, you know, what were some organizations sort of challenged with, and how they were starting to think about how to address some of these issues internally. We had some great panelists at that conversation. And this year, this session is really to continue that conversation, but really focus on, you know, sort of what organizations are actually doing, where they've had success, you know, with all the changes and all the challenges and all the conversations that have been taking place over the last, you know, 6 months or so. We really thought it would be a great idea to spotlight organizations and individuals who are doing some really good work in this space, who have actually made some significant changes within their organizations to move this conversation forward. So we're thrilled today to do that. And I'm excited to, you know, welcome Wendy John, who's the head of global diversity at Fidelity, Paul Francisco, the head of diversity for State Street, Jonathan Allen, co-founder and director of development partnerships at the Leadership Brainery, and Sunnie Kaufmann-Paulman, the new executive director of Greater Boston Police PFLAG. We're thrilled to have them here to have this conversation. And Matt's going to take us through that. But I would like to thank our current sponsors who have been with us for 2020. I want to thank Locke. I want to thank Loomis Sales, HarborVest Financial, and Tufts Health Plan for their support in 2020. I also want to recognize some of our original founding partners who I think, you know, back in the early days, if we didn't have their support, we would not be able to be where we're at today. So I want to do a shout out to Paul for State Street and Wendy for Fidelity. I mean, those two were sort of there at the beginning for us. And it's kind of nice to see the full circle. Here they are back with us again to have this conversation. So thank you for that. So what I'd like to do before we jump into Matt is take a look at how we're feeling. I think as you were entering the room, you got a little prompt to go to menti.com and enter a code and really tell us how you're feeling. You know, we're 7, 8, 9 months into this pandemic. Just take a little time to think about how you're feeling. So if you haven't already done that, if you'll take a second or so to jump into that, open up a separate web browser, put in that web address and enter that code and input a word that expresses how you're feeling right now, that'd be great. And I think I'm gonna ask Tori to maybe show us what we've got out there so far. Let's see what we got.
Well, I did want to show all these amazing, beautiful faces, but behind here.
We're trying a lot of different things today.
Yep.
Look at that. Okay. I see my word right in the middle there, hopeful. Moving around, here we go. Overwhelmed, tired, exhausted, anxious, encouraged, grateful, inspired. I love that hopeful is right there, front and center. That's great. Energized, excited, but weary. Distracted, but stretched. Concerned, tired. That's great. Anxious, hopeful, and tired seem to be the big ones. What do you think? That's pretty reflective of how we feel right now. We've got we've got 21 days. We have some big things happening. So, all right, well, thank you for sharing your feelings, folks. This obviously, it's been a really trying time for all of us, but hopefully today This will distract you a little bit and help you think through some of the really good work that our organizations are doing around this topic. So I'm gonna pass it over to Matt, but let me tell you a little bit about Matt for those of you who don't know him. Matt McTygue is a member of the board of PIOW and our treasurer. He's also the managing partner of Locke Lord's Boston office and has practiced corporate law at the firm for more than 20 years. Matt also serves on the executive committee and as secretary of the Boston Bar Association, where he previously served as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion section co-chair. And Matt is also a member of the board of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. So he's got a lot going on. So I really appreciated his willingness to take on the moderating duties today. He's a phenomenal speaker and he's also a very dear friend. So Matt, take it away.
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody. So just to reintroduce our panelists, first up we have Jonathan Allen, pronouns he, him, is the co-founder of the Leadership Brainery, a Boston-based nonprofit fostering education, equity, and generational prosperity by providing college-enrolled diverse young leaders who are working for the greater good with opportunities to advance in their education, build inclusive networks, and gain access to impactful and high-wage careers. Paul Francisco, pronouns he, him, is the Global Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Workforce Development at State Street Corporation. Wendy John, pronouns she, her, is the Head of Global Diversity and Inclusion for Fidelity Investments. And Sunnie Kaufmann-Paulman, pronouns she, her, is the Executive Director for Greater Boston PFLAG, working to advocate and advance equity and societal affirmation of LGBTQ plus people by building and strengthening loving families, safe communities, and a diverse and inclusive society. So welcome everybody again, and thank you for joining us today. And if you have questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat feature to send a question to one of the hosts, and we'll be tracking those, and we will follow up at the end with questions for our panelists. So I'm going to kick it off, start it off with a question for Wendy to take the lead on, and others can join in. As a leader of your organization looking to affect change, how have you and your organization approached action on racial equity?
Matt, great question, and I'm thrilled to be here today. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I think I would start with saying, much like many other organizations, for us, the leadership in this effort and our change has been driven from the top. So our chair and CEO, Abby Johnson, came out with a few public statements as well as calls to action for our employees internally. And I think we really have to recognize that all of us were feeling very vulnerable. People were open, to all kinds of conversations that previously were not happening as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think we found ourselves in a situation where it was fertile ground for some of the conversations around racial equity. And so as a result, we had an opportunity to have and continue to have courageous conversations. I would say we're still, about 4 months since the George Floyd murder, focused on listening and pulling together a strategy to ensure that the actions that we're taking are as a direct result of all of our employee and customer feedback and not in any way performative. We want to make sure that we are taking actions that are going to result in sustainable change. There's a lot of, concern about whether or not this moment is going to last. And we want there to be, real momentum around this. I know there's a bit of a overused phrase, but it is a marathon, not a sprint. And we will not, we'll have a few changes that will happen, but it's going to take time to really undo some of the things that have been around for a long time. And so we need everyone to be really patient, but engaged in that work. Some examples of the actions we've taken so far, I would start probably with my role. As John Basili well knows, I am the third head of diversity and inclusion at Fidelity. And prior to me taking the role, it reported into our human resources organization. And so we changed the reporting structure, having the job report into our chief financial officer, which certainly within our environment is an elevation of the role. It also puts it where the money is, which certainly allows for there to be, demonstrated support. we created a senior advisor team that serves as a board for the enterprise diversity and inclusion team. So it's a sounding board and a listening post for me and others, and try to work on some of that change and also to validate and vet some of the actions that I spoke about earlier. I think in the immediate, couple of weeks after George Floyd, we instituted a match program for our associates because we knew that our employees wanted to be part of the change that was needed in the world. And so we identified over 25 nonprofit organizations, some with a national scope and others locally where we have regional presence, where our associates could identify where they wanted to support. And the company, the Fidelity Foundation actually matched that 2-for-1. And so that's really amplified and been a way to demonstrate very quickly our support for efforts in the community. And so I'd say last, there are probably 2 other areas that are of importance. So in addition to making sure and focusing on our environment being more inclusive for our existing diverse employees, we have been very focused on our hiring efforts and being very intentional in making ourselves more attractive and appealing to diverse and underrepresented communities, and really driving and focusing our engagement there. And then I'd say the other area of opportunity is in our supplier diversity. And so looking for and maybe asking more of our partners about the minority and women-led representation in the firms that they're bringing to the table. So it really has to be a consistent effort across a number of different fronts, but I'd say we are very much focused on, the intersectionality that John mentioned, diversity across a number of spectrums, and then making sure that not only in our hiring, in our internal environment, but also in our opportunities to collaborate with others, that we're doing that with intention.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to take this up and let us know what's happening at State Street?
What isn't happening at State Street, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. I mean, it's just been a whirlwind of things that have transpired since the unfortunate incident. So first of all, let me just say how happy I am to be here, pleased to see all these beautiful faces, and thank you so much, and honored to be invited to this conversation with this group and with my friends. So it feels like a family reunion of people who I haven't seen in quite a while, at least physically. At State Street, similar to what Wendy just mentioned, I mean, we kick into high gear a number of things that many other companies have thought about and have activated. I think that the difference for us is that this is not new work. The racial equity and social justice work is work that State Street has been engaged in and has been doing for quite a bit. And what this provided was just really an opportunity for us to amplify those efforts in a more significant way. We had began to have race dialogues, in conversations about racism as far back as almost 2 years ago with one of our employee networks that convened other employee networks. So we had our Black professionals group get together with our Italian American and our Irish American professionals group to have a deep dialogue around racism and race and how that manifests, not only in our workplaces, but externally. So I think a lot of the things we had already embarked on, which was made it a little bit easier for us to sort of double down on some of the things that we felt were necessary. I think the message and the tone from the top has always been there, but our CEO, Ronald Hanley, was very public about how he was feeling. He was very reflective. He mentioned to the organization that he wanted to take some time to think about things and to figure out how do we do things differently, and how do we do things sustainably. And I think that that's how we've gone about thinking about what the actions are. And we have come with a set of 10 actions, many of which Wendy has outlined, that we feel are just the beginning and the foundation of what we need to do in order to move significantly forward in issues of equity, inclusion, and others. So we're proud of that. But I think what has taken me and given me a higher comfort level as a diversity practitioner has been the intensity, the sustainability, the different type of conversations that we're having at the organization are, I just have never seen those type of conversations in that intense and sustainable way. So that gives me, and one of the words that I wrote was hopeful. That gives me a lot of encouragement. We, have a number of diversity councils that we established, but one of the things that we are doing differently is each of the 10 actions that we, and they're public, they're on our website for any of you who are curious about seeing them. Any of the 10 actions have a management committee sponsor, if not two. Actually, most of them have two, if not three, who are directly responsible and accountable for making sure that we deliver on those things. And they range from issues of representation. So how do we increase at our senior levels, specifically around Black and Latinx talent? How do we increase our representation there? We know we have, we're not where we want to be. That goes for our board of directors as well. How do we make sure that the people who are already inside of State Street from these populations feel as though that this is the same State Street, that it's for everyone else that doesn't look like them, and that they have a sense of belonging, that they should have, and that they have a sense that, yes, I can be successful here. So that looking at representation across all of our programs, all of our succession plans, all of our committees, making sure that there's equitable access to those things are things that we're doing. We're doing things around supplier diversity and making sure that we are impacting the economic wealth and well-being of communities that are underprivileged, underserved, and whatever the descriptors are. We know that wealth creation, access to tools, access to capital is critical. So we are doing things there. Our foundation has made a commitment similar to what Fidelity has done in terms of matching 2-to-1 those contributions that our employees make to any organizations that pursue social and racial justice issues. And one that I'm very proud of, which is the New Commonwealth Fund. We made a $5 million commitment for the next 5 years to that, and that is the New Commonwealth Fund is the Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund that 19 of us started, Black and Latinx executives around the state. So those are the type of things that we are focused on. I think, to reflect back on what Wendy said, my biggest worry is how do we maintain momentum? How do we continue to focus on the things that really are truly going to change the circumstances and that are really going to have a lasting impact? I am not at all interested in sitting here a year or two from now and having the same conversation as to why things haven't changed and why we haven't been able to figure things out. I am reporting to our CEO, which gives me a pretty good platform and opportunity to impact and create change. So, I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation, but just wanted to share a couple of the things that we're doing at State Street, which again, is just the beginning and not enough.
Thanks, Paul. A lot to digest in all that you both, your companies are working on. If you had to, and this is going a little bit off of the questions that we talked about, but I'm really interested to know, especially consistent with the last comment that you made, which I think is the big one. What are the things that are really, if you had to pick two things for your organization to focus on, and you listed, there are a dozen things that people are working on. What are the things that are the most important to work on in order to really move the needle? And limit it to two so that, we can get Wendy's view on that as well.
Would you like me to go first? Paula, go ahead.
Actually, Wendy, why don't you go first?
Sure. Just give Paul a rest. We go way back, so I'm happy to give the assist. I think, I would say for me, the first thing would be real behavioral change. So at Fidelity, we have this concept of simple starts, which are small behavioral changes that we each can make that can have a real tangible impact on diversity and inclusion. And it involves a number of things, right? So whether that is, you know, being very intentional and setting up time with someone very different from you, you know, whether that be once a month. I mean, we're not asking you to do a ton. Changing up your diet so that you are reading books and articles and watching movies that maybe bring a different perspective, that you're looking around the tables that you're sitting at, virtual Zoom tables, right? The meetings that you're in, and asking yourself, you know, whether or not you have all of the perspectives that you need to have at the table. Similarly, when you're doing hiring, making sure that you have diverse panels. So we give a number of different options and ways that our leaders can think about you know, how to get involved. And I think the real message there is we see that a lot of people who are newer to this conversation have fear or trepidation of getting it wrong. And so therefore they don't start. And we're trying to make the start really easy. So it's not by any means that we think that the work of diversity and inclusion is simple, but we feel like getting started needs to be very simple. So that's the first thing I would say. I think the second thing is really just, again, that recognition that it isn't an overnight thing. This is unlike some of the other areas where we've been able to like throw a ton of people or efforts or resources against it. It's, in my words, it's hard work, which makes it hard work. And it's not that we're trying to change anybody's value systems or anything like that, but we are saying we want you to treat each other with humanity. And so we have historically kept our personal and our professional lives separate. And we're saying that's no longer the future. So those are two slightly different things. One is about, let's change your day-to-day behavior. Let's be thoughtful and intentional about it, and let's adapt to and adopt those simple starts. I think the other is really also being patient and giving ourselves grace, because it will actually take time, and recognizing that this is hard work, but it is the right work.
So for State Street, I think the two things that will, if I had to pick two things, it would be our second action, which calls for the review of all our processes, human capital processes, and to audit and to make sure that there's equity built into each and every one of them, right? And that is, so I think if we are able to get our current employees feeling as though that they have the same opportunities to advance at State Street, and we have evidence of that happening, I think that that's going to be the most impactful thing. But the second thing, I think, is intentionality, and I think is going to come down to how people are going to take this work personally and make sure that they are engaged and involved in this fight ongoing. And I mean our white allies. At the end of the day, if this is about racial and social justice, the folks who have, I would say, less to gain, and I'm not generalizing here, but the sharing of power, the sharing of the realization that this war isn't equitable, and the realization that there has to be, an accountability here that is shared. I think that that's going to determine how successful we are. If there is fatigue around this by the end of this year, on top of this pandemic, we're not going to be successful. And we're going to find those of us who have been champions of this work, and those of you who are in this call, who are tired of carrying the load and tired of sort of, banging the drums around this, we are in danger of a year from now, it being the same group of people talking about the same thing and not having those allies there as they were early this spring, as they are here now. So I think figuring out how do we continue with that allyship and intentionality, I think is going to be key to this changing.
Thanks, Paul. All right, moving to the next question. The pandemic has been a time of isolation for all of us. We've had to manage multiple complexities and responsibilities our work and home life have blended. This is all compounded by our national reckoning with systemic prejudice and oppression. And the challenges that are being faced by people can be more difficult for the BIPOC, QTPOC, and LGBTQ plus communities, who often experience greater isolation even in normal times. How are organizations supporting, engaging, and ensuring that these colleagues aren't losing ground? I'm going to ask Jonathan to take the lead on this one.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by saying this important phrase, and even after listening to Wendy and Paul, which are incredible inspirations to us all, it's this notion that when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, when we talk about the task at hand, moving the needle on equity, the reality is for even the people who don't see themselves as gaining anything in this pursuit, the reality is we are all missing out on what a more diverse, equitable, and fair society will render us, even in this pursuit of what we call a more perfect union. We have so much all to gain from learning from each other, from our experiences and the gifts and talents. And as a person of color, but also as a member of the LGBT community, as you mentioned, Matt, this moment as we are facing this pandemic has rendered so many challenges for our community, certainly at the intersections and at the leadership Brainery. At the beginning of the pandemic, we responded to the notion that as schools were beginning to shut down, we learned that it was the diverse and first generation students who were most disproportionately and adversely affected. They were the ones who did not have food when they were not able to access dining halls. They were the ones who did not have shelter when they had to get out of their dorm rooms. They were the ones who were using their work study to live and oftentimes send money back home, because what the pandemic has rendered and shown us is that many of the disparities of our marginalized communities were disparities that these communities were already facing, that the pandemic only exacerbated, made worse. And so for the leadership Brainery, one thing that we learned early on is that our LGBT students were the ones who were trying to return home, and some of them, their families would not accept them, would not allow them to come back. And so we, even as we do the work that we're doing to pipeline more diverse and first generation college student leaders into competitive graduate and professional schools, so that we can broaden the pool of diverse talent that's available for the workforce, certainly at higher levels. We realize that the disparity around our LGBT students, even within their own communities of color also, there is still a gap there in how people coming from the LGBT community are treated, are supported. And that's why even the notion of the work that we have to do is so important, and why we need allies, and I would dare to say accomplices, both on racial equity and on LGBTQ equality. We need accomplices in this work. That's why I'm grateful for people like Paul Francisco, who was one of the first straight cisgendered supporters, accomplices of the leadership Brainery. And we know oftentimes one of the realities is that as organizations and efforts, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a nonprofit founder, co-founder, that these communities often don't have the safety nets in place and the communities to truly ensure that they thrive and have access to opportunity. And so it is utmost important that communities and people who may not identify as a person of color, may not identify as LGBTQ+, find it their business, find it their mission to be in solidarity in ensuring that these communities have hope, belonging, and action. That's the mission, is to foster communities of hope, belonging, and action.
Thanks, Jonathan. Sunnie, do you want to respond next?
Thanks, Matt. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel today. Jonathan, coming after you, I feel inspired and also grateful that, Greater Boston PFLAG is an ally organization. And when George Floyd was murdered, we sat down as a team, as a staff, and really thought about, what does that mean? What are we going to do as an ally organization to serve the communities that need our allyship, and how do we transition from being an ally to, as Jonathan said, an accomplice? And so really we thought about, even as a nonprofit, what are the ways that we can put our money where our mouth is and identify organizations that are doing the work in the LGBTQ plus BIPOC communities? Where are the intersectionalities, and how can we support that? And so we did, as a staff, come together and sponsor other organizations that were doing the work with our dollars. We also took a hard look at what we look like and who we are and who we're serving, and realized, as Paul and Wendy spoke, that we really needed to look internally. For us, it went very deep into our infrastructure and our systems and our practices, and identify that we needed to focus there first to make organizational change for equity before we were ever going to be successful in impacting the communities that we want to be serving. And so we have engaged in some really critical self-reflection and self-work, and engaged outside organizations to come in and do the work with us, because obviously we had not shifted the needle on our own. So we've engaged with YW Boston. We're participating in their Inclusion Boston cohort that'll launch in January of this year, to turn our infrastructure inside out and find out what we can do as an organization to make a change for equity.
Thanks, Sunnie. Paul, Wendy, either of you have anything you want to add on this topic, or we can move to the third question?
No, I just quickly, I will say that both what Jonathan and Sunnie have said shouldn't go underscored, which is we can't do this alone, right? We tend to try to go at it alone, and I think that is where many of us have failed to sort of move our organizations forward. And I think that relying on whether it's not-for-profit partners, community partners, and other organizations, and collaborating on solutions is what's going to take, because the inequalities and the lack of equity, it is systemic, it is institutional, and it is not something that any one organization is going to be able to figure out on their own. Yes, maybe for their own little four walls. But I think, in order for us to really break through, we just need more people thinking differently about how to tackle this issue. And so the more we are able to partner with organizations like Jonathan's and Sunnie's, and PIOW, I think that's where the solutions, the big solutions will come from.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And I would just say, I think, sort of to put a fine point on Paul's point, we need everyone, right, involved in this work, because it is going to impact all of us. It currently does, even if it's not as obvious to us that it is impacting us. And so we need to go at it while we often spring into action as a result of events that impact one group. The reality is that that's the symptom, right? And we all have to kind of come together in partnership. And I know our allies and accomplices that are in the, sort of in the disability space would talk about, the curb cut effect that they know about, where even though you might be focusing on a solution for one, the reality is that the solutions that you come up with actually benefit everyone. And so those are sort of, that's what we need, is we need that amplification. I think, again, when we talk about sort of the sense of urgency that we're all feeling around building momentum, that's why we need to come at it from an intersectionality perspective and have everybody and all voices represented at the table.
Well, I would just say that this is exactly what our organization, Pride in Our Workplace, was thinking when putting this together. You know, we could not, as the LGBTQ plus community, could not be where we are without the support and help of so many people, and following in the footsteps of the civil rights movement. You know, and I think we all agree, those of us who are focused on creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive society, believe that when we all rise, when we all come together, we all rise. And on that topic, I'd love to talk about the specific thing that we've been talking about, collaborations. What are you doing, or what are you seeing in the way of collaborations? I know Sunnie mentioned the collaborations that she's doing with, that her organization is doing with YW Boston. You know, we are seeing some in our firm collaborations with ERGs, and you know, instead of having different ERG meetings, doing group ERG meetings to talk about the topic of today, systemic racism and oppression, and how we can all get together. You know, Wendy, since you're on my screen, you want to take it first and let us know what you're seeing in your organization for collaborations?
Sure thing, I'm happy to. And you already sort of set the stage. So again, I think under John's leadership over a decade ago, we built a tremendously strong foundation by establishing our employee resource groups. And we also have other affinity groups, which we call special interest groups, or SIGs. So the combination of our ERGs and SIGs, we're now up to 10 of them, you know, really is where we see our real, you know, engagement across the firm. We have more than half of our employees are a member of at least one of our ERGs, and many are members of up to 3. And so we've been very targeted and had already decided earlier this year to sort of focus on more partnership and collaboration by hosting cross-functional signature events, as opposed to having, you know, multiple events happening from each of the individual ERGs or special interest groups. Doesn't mean that they aren't having their own events, but we felt that there were some topics where the level of interest across the ERGs was such that it was better to collaborate and bring all of our resources together. The other thing I would say that I'm really excited about, and we might be behind State Street, but we learn. I like to learn from example, is that we are looking forward, actually, not this coming weekend, but next weekend, the weekend starting the 22nd of October, is going to be our first Solidarity weekend at Fidelity, and it's Solidarity for all. And so this is, again, another effort that's coming out of our employee resource groups. And I would share that initially, the concept came out of the racial equity events that happened in late May. And there was a real talk about allyship and accomplice approach. The idea generated out of our women's leadership group to bring all of the ERGs together in solidarity with our Aspire employee resource group, which is for Black and Latinx employees. But I think what we've found is, as you pay more attention, and certainly as we look at what's happening in our broader community in the US right now, many of us are feeling sort of displaced, impacted, whether by the pandemic. There's also xenophobia amongst our Asian population as a result of coronavirus. And so we really felt it important to take the opportunity to use this Solidarity Weekend to educate about intersectionality and to bring awareness, while still in solidarity with our Black and Brown employees. And so we're really excited about it and looking forward to it being more of an annual event where we can all demonstrate, you know, through various actions, ways in which we are supporting each other. And so one other thing that we're doing with that weekend is we're also making some grants to local organizations that are supporting racial equity and social justice work. So it's a combination of both efforts within our workplace and outside the workplace.
Thanks, Wendy. Sunnie, do you want to share more about the collaborations that your organization is working on?
Absolutely. You know, we have the great fortune to work with a lot of the organizations, the companies that are represented here on the call today. And we get a lot of requests from ERGs, specifically LGBTQ plus ERGs, to deliver our educational programs to their ERG. And one of the things that we have done, our program team has begun to do, is to question where the support is coming from for the ERG. Often ERGs or affinity groups are led by a volunteer team member, and there may not necessarily be a budget behind it. And so encouraging to bring the support to the top, as Wendy and Paul have spoken about, and to identify how we can bring the programs to the organization or the company overall and cross ERG present because of the intersectionality of the LGBTQ plus community. And so one of the ways we've been doing that is I've been stepping in and helping support the ERGs to have a conversation with leadership about what that might look like and how to bring our educational programs beyond the ERG, especially because it is critical in the LGBTQ plus community that they have an affirming work environment and society. And so if we're educating the LGBTQ plus ERG, oftentimes we're educating to the group that knows the information already, and where it may benefit more is to bring in the rest of the company so that they can support their LGBTQ plus employees. Another way that we are looking really to amplify the work is identifying where we can join coalitions or where we can join work that is already happening and amplify that. So looking at organizations for us like the Out Metro West, Bagley, the Trans Emergency Fund, and either again putting our dollars or our time and our volunteer hours towards the work that we're doing. And often if we are requested to do a program that may be better served by an organization that is representing those needs more directly, referring to that organization rather than trying to take on the work ourselves.
Thanks, Sunnie. All right, I'm going to shift to a different question. I'm going to focus this. Jonathan, if you would answer this one first. As a community leader in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what is working to advance racial equity and making real change? What have you advised companies that are looking for consultation, and what are organizations looking for in terms of that consultation?
Thank you, Matt. I'll start by saying the word courage. Courage is what's moving the needle forward. As we've alluded from most of everyone's responses, you know, it's this need, one, for everyone to take a self-check, a personal check, asking ourselves, what do we care about? What matters to us? And the lives and experiences that folk with, as Howard Thurman would say, with their backs up against the wall, their lives, when they matter to us enough that we think about how we can get active and transition our advocacy from mere conversations to sustainable solutions, because we realize that in real time, people are hurting. It takes courage to do that. It takes courage to potentially lose something in this fight. And whether that's some of your loved ones and friends who may not be as open-minded and loving toward others, courage is crucial. But then for us at Leadership Brainery, we're leading diversity and developing the future. And so we see that the opportunity is in our young people. It is in the future. It is ensuring that the next generation of diverse leaders have access to opportunity. And so with that comes for us a need for greater collaboration with both academic institutions as well as with employers, corporations who are saying, we don't have enough diverse talent here. And we desire to move the needle on this. The Leadership Brainery is saying, well, let's bring us together and let's figure out how we close the gaps on access to opportunity. And that requires a pipeline. That requires us investing earlier on into the next generation to ensure they have the resources and tools and support systems that they need to be able to thrive. We're excited that we're bringing on Catherine Wong, who is the former director at Boston College of their urban outreach initiative, which is crucial. And we're excited about this next phase of our development because it allows us to work with our partners, schools, as well as organizations, employers, to think about how do we be more anti-racist? How do we be anti-racist in our work, particularly with working with young people, with young leaders? How do we ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, we're working to foster communities of hope, belonging, and action? And now, more than ever, in a world where online engagement is really taking dominant and center force, figuring out how do we do these things in a virtual setting as well, which is why we've begun to launch the LB Connect, which is our online community, our online platform to allow for this engagement. And so for us, on a consulting front, as we engage with companies, it is how do we get to diverse talent? How do we, one, be able to retain them when we talk about Boston, for example, when we are trying to recruit more diverse talent into the Boston area, and then they say, well, why do I want to be in Boston? And so we have so much to do. One, to show and promote all of the great things that there is in Boston for more diverse talent to want to be here, and to highlight the ways in which we are being not just intentional, but very intentional. I tell people that once you say that you were intentional, ask yourself, could I have been another level of intentional? Because the issues that we're facing are so deep-seated, the disparities are so deep-seated, that oftentimes our first take at an issue requires a second and a third and a fourth take to ensure that we're thinking about the communities who are layered under the oppression that we are seeking to rid our country and our society of.
Thanks, Jonathan. Sunnie, is there anything you want to add to this? This was the question: as community leaders in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what is working to advance racial equity and making real change?
I think, my peers on the panel will be better suited to answer this question. Sure. I think, our organization is at such the beginning of the journey. We are at the place of recognizing that we need to do the work. I think Wendy, Paul would probably be better to answer that question.
All right, I'm going to kick it over to Paul.
Sure. So I think just bringing us back quickly to the collaboration topic here, I just wanted to make sure that as organizations, the way we think about activating these, one thing that we're doing, for example, is taking a look outside of State Street and saying, who are the other set of players in our world that we need to partner with and come up with solutions. And so we have a couple of efforts happening. One, the asset management industry effort, where you have some of the largest asset managers in the world coming together with the Ford Foundation and Robert Smith from Vista Equity Partners, and who are saying, okay, enough is enough. And this group right here of organizations can probably impact this work in a way that has never been impacted before, not only by, figuring out how do we leverage our resources to do so, but because the people and the desire to do things differently and better, and the impact that we can have in our community. So I think that that's one thing that we can continue to do. I would say that in general, there are three things that I'm thinking about, right? And it's, I call it the triple H effect, and don't quote me on that, but it's the way I think about it. It is hope, humanity, and humility, right? And hope is because, this is hard, and this is tough, and this will not happen overnight. And so we have to be hopeful, and we have to have hope that, you know, whatever we do, and what Jonathan said, we need to have courage to do it, that we do it with this angle in mind that things will be better, that, you know, things will be different, that, you know, we will find a society that's more just, equitable and welcoming, you know, and celebrating of difference. And that will help all of us. So I think we all need to, and I love the fact that that word hopeful, and it's despite all that we are facing, was front and center, right? So I think we need to do that. The humanity piece can't be understated. And this is not something that workplaces, for the most part, at least those of us who are in industry, have been known for, right? And we sort of keep church and state separate, right? And politics and all these different things that make us who we are, make us human. So I think that it's going to be, from an institutional perspective, it's going to be important for us to remember, right, that to put the H in humanity, right, and remember that our colleagues are human beings that have these everyday concerns, that have these fears, and they have these worries, and they have you know, things in their lives that are either preventing them from being the best they can be for our organizations, or influencing how they are operating inside our organization. So we need to make sure that we continue to keep that in front. And the humility piece is really about, this is the time for us to realize and understand that we don't know it all, and that we either need help, or that we need to figure out, you know, how to do things differently, and accept the fact that things are just not working. And that's okay, right? You know what, we either have had blinders on, or have not focused and pay attention enough on this issue. And we need to, and I need to sort of either say, I'm sorry, you know what, I should have been better about being an ally. I should have been better about being there for you. I should have said something when something happened that impacted the African American community, and I chose to ignore that. And I'm sorry for that, but I'm here now, and let's you know, again, figure out together moving forward. So the humility, I think, is going to be critical. So those are the three things that keep coming up for me, that I think that if people focus on those things, I think we'll be better off.
Thanks, Paul. All right, so we've ran out of time for my questions, having only answered half of them. But the audience has given us a lot of questions, and so thank you, Tori, for sending them to me. And I am going to run through some of these questions in the time we have remaining. The first one I'm going to hit is this one. A lot of organizations are doing a lot right now to highlight and focus on racial diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. But I've seen very few focus specifically on how LGBTQ BIPOC are included in such initiatives. Have any of these organizations expressly considered intersectional identities and taken specific measures to make sure that these communities are included in leadership roles, and have methods of expressing the challenges they've faced?
So I'm happy to start. And then again, because I'm in learning mode, I'm going to be listening intently to Paul. You know, I think so I think it's a great question. And I wanted to make sure to acknowledge the fact that I'm here today and very much supported by members of our Pride ERG, our employee resource group around, you know, for LGBTQ plus employees. So one of the things that I'm very passionate about, and I know it's definitely on my radar for 2021, is self-identification. And so, you know, and I recognize that we have to ensure that we have, you know, the psychological safety in our environment and a level of inclusion that would allow people to feel comfortable sharing that. And I say this, right, a few days on the heels of National Coming Out Day. And so I understand, and I do not want to diminish, I cannot necessarily empathize, but I don't want to diminish the process that an individual has to go through to make that decision. But to some extent, it's really important because in terms of being able to identify and really, get people on board with where the opportunities are and what is really happening within the organization, we need the data. And so right now, like what I find, and I am newer to this work, so maybe I'm coming in with that perspective, is that, when people are like, we want the data, and then they get frustrated because the actions or the conversation is only happening on, the basis of race and ethnicity. A lot of that is tied to the fact that is the data that is, more readily available. And even when I'm talking with members and leadership representing our enable ERG, which is those that are differently abled, there's also a much more compelling case for those that do not have visible differences. We need information to be able to really make the case for the work and the engagement and where the opportunity lies. So that's not a deflection. I want to be very clear to say that there are things that we're doing, and I try to be very, clear, transparent, that when I'm speaking about diverse communities, I mean diverse across all spectrums. When you're speaking about Black and Brown or Black and Latinx or Asian, it's really important that you say that very clearly. And I know that that's a change that for many is sort of like, really, I can say that at work? Yes, you can. And it's very important that we're very clear about what we're speaking about. And I know that we're not all one-dimensional, but to some extent, the availability of data makes it really challenging to even advance this intersectionality conversation. And so that's where I would tell you I'm focusing my efforts and energy. But I would say that there are places, particularly both in terms of trying to pivot our employee resource groups into more of a business resource group, where our Pride ERG has been very helpful in helping and being the voice of our LGBTQ plus customer base. And we're customer obsessed at Fidelity. So being able to speak to it or come at it from the voice of the customer has been helpful in advancing that perspective. But I would say that I do think there's a lot of opportunity that's tied to getting at some of the data.
I love how Wendy keeps playing this I'm new to this game card, so she's been, I would say, champion of this work for a long time. So, and Wendy, what you're doing is terrific and magnificent, and look forward to seeing what else you do. This is one of those questions, right, that look, intersectionality is such a hot topic, and we began doing this. We began to think about how do we do this more intentionally. Last year, the theme for this year, before the pandemic hit, was intersectionality. So everything that we have been doing at State Street at least has been geared towards bringing all our employee networks together, all employees together, have conversations that are sort of transcendental of one identity, if you will. But I do feel that there are times where you need to call out what it is you're trying to impact, and you should not be apologetic around that. And just like we call out allyship for the LGBTQ community, just like we call out, female representation and in organizations, we should be able to call out race and ethnicity. And it's not because it's either or, it should be both and. There should not be amongst us in our communities of difference, there shouldn't be a pecking order, if you will, as to, what issues are the most important. I think that there are relevancy that you need to place into each of our what we consider our identities that we need to pay attention to at any given moment, any given time. Just because, for example, we are doing work around racial equity at State Street doesn't mean that we stop doing work on, our LGBTQ strategies and our persons with disability strategies, our veteran strategies, our female representation strategies. They all need work, they all need support, and they all need attention. But again, back to how are we, all of us in this call, being allies to the cause, and the plight of our colleagues, by the way, who are part of our community, our LGBTQ community, who happen to be Black, who happen to be Latinx or Indigenous or, Asian. How do we sort of wrap our arms around them during this time based on their experiences or what they're experiencing there at that time for that part of their whole being that we need to acknowledge, that we need to say, right? Our Black LGBT community, our Black trans community, and you need to call it out and you need to say, how do we support that? How do we support them? How do I become an ally? And I think that we need to just be very specific about that, because otherwise what tends to happen is, then, we go back to the pecking order where, female, representation becomes sort of like the topical thing. And so we all gravitate towards that. That's easier. We forget about, persons with disabilities. We forget about veterans. And we forget about all these other things that are harder to measure because we just don't have either. We have restrictions around those things, but stuff like this are important. So that question it's a really important one, but for me, it's a both and. It shouldn't be, we all should be part of this conversation constantly, but we need to call things out as they are, when they need to be called out and when they need to be supported.
Thanks, Paul. I think we probably have room for one more question, and I'm going to ask Sunnie to lead it, followed by Jonathan. The question from the audience is, what are the best ways to be an effective ally?
I think Paul really, I love the 3 H's. I think that really resonated with me. As Matt mentioned in the very beginning when he introduced me, I'm new to my role. I came into the organization the last week of February of this year, and a lot has happened in the last 7 months. And what I really have had to do is, I didn't have all those H words, but that's really what has been driving me. And I think what I really recognized is that I very quickly needed to figure out what we could do to become an ally, learn about what it means to be an ally, identify then how do we transition from, as Jonathan said, an ally to an accomplice. What are the things that we can be doing in the short term, and what is really the long-term shift that we need to take to move the needle forward. And one of the first things that I recognized is that I needed to be vulnerable to learning. I needed to step out of the way when there were other voices that needed to be amplified. I needed to bring in community partners who could educate us and help us really learn about the experience. Because while I identify myself as LGBTQ+, I am white, and my experience is a white experience. And so I cannot speak for the experience of a Black LGBTQ+ identified individual. And it's important to bring those voices in. So that's what I would say, is really to be able to move beyond yourself and find the places where you can connect to those who are in the community, not to depend on them to teach you or lead you or to educate you or do the work for you, but to begin to learn and then use what you've learned to start transitioning that to action.
Yeah, I think that's really key, Sunnie, and this notion that you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You're talking about a country that from its inception was founded through oppression and the dehumanization of other people. That has to be set with, it has to be dealt with and recognized. And in doing so, there will be some discomfort with accepting responsibility for what we now experience and are seeing continuing to be perpetuated in our country in different forms. When we talk about slavery and it's morphed into Jim Crow and morphed into mass incarceration, and in so many different ways, the inequities of a society that's been built on inequality. we see that now more than ever, we must act with a sense of urgency, a state of emergency. We are in a state of emergency, and we must act like it. And as Wendy stated in the beginning of the call, yes, we have to have a good entryway, an entryway that allows us to jumpstart. And I think, as Sunnie alluded, it is sitting to learn. What you don't know is asking questions and listening, so that you be able to download more knowledge about the real experiences that people have faced in this country for hundreds of years to this very day. And with being armed with that knowledge, again, pouring back to the very beginning, that this is a very, while also professional and communal effort, is personal. It's personal. And you have to make a personal decision about what matters to you. You have to make a personal decision about who you are, what you stand for, what you believe in, and how you will use the energy and the breath that you have and the time that you have on this earth. How will you use it to transform the inequality and the inequity in our world? And that's why I mentioned that, even as Paul alluded, there are many people who say, well, it doesn't matter. I don't gain anything from giving up a whole bunch of my resources to other people. Well, the reality is, if we are living in a society that's been built off the oppression of other people and the exploitation of other people, then perhaps the stuff that people have isn't, and fairly, wasn't actually earned in a very fair way. So maybe our approach moving forward is, what responsibility do we all have with moving our country forward to be a more equitable, fair, and just country? And so that requires a level of what I would consider race consciousness and race responsibility. We must be conscious and responsible in doing this work. That's why colorblindedness is not the way to go. We have to see it, we have to address it, and we have to be committed, invested even, into seeing that we have a more just and equitable future. And as Wendy alluded, and that requires behavior change. We got to do things. If we do what we've always done, we'll get what we've always got. And so it requires that we be more innovative than we've ever been before, and we come together across our varying perspectives, experiences like we never have before, to do something that's transformative for now and for generations to come.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you. All right, so we're running out of time, so I'm going to turn this over to Karen for the closing remarks. Thank you to all the panelists. Karen, please take it away.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Karen Young. I'm on the PIOW board, and I can see everybody's already starting to clap. So if you would join me in continuing to clap for our panelists today, for Jonathan, for Wendy, for Paul, for Sunnie. Thank you so much. Appreciate the encouragement, the courage, the call to commitment and responsibility. Your thought leadership, your actions mean a lot, and we appreciate you sharing them with us today. The importance of centering racial equity within the context of our organizations and the actions that each of us can take to ensure that there is equity is such an important topic, and we're so grateful for you being with us today. We also want to thank our sponsors, Locke Lord, Sales, Harbor Vest, Tufts Health Plan. We appreciate your sponsorship because it allows us to fulfill our mission at PIOW, which is to convene events like today to foster thought leadership and to foster encouragement such that our organizations and we as people have an opportunity to experience an inclusive, equitable, and welcoming environment. So thank you. And so on that note, we would also like to invite any of you who would consider joining us as sponsors to consider that today, such that we could use your help and energy as an organization that would benefit not only fostering more programs like today, but benefiting your organization by providing professional development, networking and community building, and even some marketing and brand awareness on some of the important topics of the intersection of LGBTQ identity and others. So if you were engaged today and you would like to ask your company to join us as a sponsor, you can do several things. You could contact us at membership@piow.org. You could follow us on LinkedIn. You could reach out to any of us on the board to ask more information about the various sponsorship levels that are available and how to get more engaged. So I see there was a question, was today's session recorded? And I also wanted to address that before closing, that today's session was recorded. Our panelists have affirmed their willingness to have it be recorded. I think we intended to share that with everyone who joined the call. And if you feel that you may have been included visually and you would prefer not to, please just let us know. Otherwise, we will be recording this and it will be available on YouTube, and we'll be sharing that out. And hope that you'll share that with other people. So again, we thank you and appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.